Have you ever felt like you're playing a board game but someone keeps changing the rules right in the middle of your turn? Well, for an entire generation of Americans, that is not just a feeling. It's a highly measurable economic reality. In this explainer, we're diving into something pretty serious: the structural economic shifts that are fundamentally altering the life trajectory of the millennial generation. And look, we're not dealing in opinions today. We are going to rely strictly on official data from the Federal Reserve, the Census Bureau, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and the Congressional Budget Office. We're going to use this data to understand exactly why the economic ground has shifted so dramatically beneath our feet. So, we have to ask the heavy question, right? Is the American dream dead? For years, this whole conversation has been completely dominated by cultural myths, debates about work ethic or lifestyle choices or consumer preferences. But today, we're stripping all of that away. We're focusing entirely on the hard, structural economic realities. We're looking straight at the numbers to see exactly what's happening to wealth, to debt, and honestly, to the very fabric of American demographic life. To understand exactly where we are right now, we really have to understand where we came from. For decades, the whole conceptual framework of the American dream rested on a super predictable life cycle pathway. It was a reliable blueprint. You get a post-secondary education. You land a stable career. You form an independent household and buy a home. You get married, start a family, and then over time, primarily through that residential real estate, you accumulate wealth. That was the reliable socioeconomic continuum for the greatest generation, the silent generation, and the baby boomers. But then we hit a massive structural disruption. When you look at Federal Reserve data that maps out median household income trajectories across 5 different generations, you see this giant divergence for millennials. Economic mobility, which is essentially the probability of earning more in real terms than your parents did at the exact same age. Well, that traditional upward curve, it just flattens out entirely against the massive weight of modern expenses. So that wealth gap between generations, it isn't just some illusion or talking point. It's a measurable reality etched right into the data.
Okay, so what exactly is causing this divergence? Let's get into the first major barrier, the stagnant wage trap.
So on paper, household take-home pay has actually seen marginal gains across generations. For example, the real median household income in 2024 was $83,730. And sure, that's up modestly from about $79,500 in 2022. But here's the catch. Those absolute gains are basically a trap. Why? Because they completely fail to keep pace with these massive inflationary anchors, like education and shelter, that are actively dragging down millennials' purchasing power. Having a higher absolute income simply doesn't mean much of anything if your ability to actually buy things is being systematically stripped away.
And that brings us right to the most formidable of those anchors, barrier number 2, the housing market barrier.
Historically, homeownership was your ultimate hedge against inflation, right? It was the absolute bedrock of middle-class wealth. But just think about this structural disconnect for a second. We have that 2024 median household income of $83,730, battling against the staggering first quarter 2026 median home price of $403,200. The ratio of home prices to incomes has hit historically absurd levels. Housing is no longer just a standard living expense, it has become a highly restrictive barrier that requires these massive cash down payments that current incomes literally cannot support.
And if you're thinking, well, I'll just rent, unfortunately, the rental market offers no refuge either. Get a load of this statistic, 21%. According to the Census Bureau, the median asking price for vacant rental units surged by over 21% in just a 3-year window. It jumped from $301,700 in the third quarter of 2022 to $365,800 by late 2025. So whether you're trying to buy or trying to rent, rapid price appreciation is vastly outpacing any sort of wage growth.
So housing is completely squeezing this generation from one side. Now let's introduce the other side of the vice, the student debt anchor and budget squeeze.
Millennials entered the labor market carrying unprecedented, frankly historic, student loan obligations. And when you combine that debt load with the 2024 Consumer Expenditure Survey data, the squeeze becomes painfully clear. Out of an average $78,535 annual household budget, housing and transportation instantly cannibalize over 50% of the pie. That's just to put a roof over your head and physically get to work. It leaves incredibly thin margins for personal insurance or retirement, forcing what economists refer to as capital decumulation. In plain English, it means there is essentially nothing left over at the end of the month to actually build wealth.
And when your monthly budget looks like that, eventually something has to give. Which leads us to part 4, delayed milestones and demographics.
The economic squeeze we were just talking about, it isn't just about numbers in a bank account.
it actively alters the real-world demographic fabric of the entire country. It triggers these cascading failures in the traditional life cycle, basically demographic dominoes. Because financial independence and stable housing are delayed, we immediately see delayed marriage. That directly leads to delayed childbirth, which then ultimately results in shrinking household sizes. Let's be clear, these are not cool lifestyle fads. They are structural adaptations to a highly restrictive economic environment.
Let's look at the stark reality of that very first domino. Back in 1975, for the boomer and silent generations, married couples made up 66%, nearly 2/3 of all U.S. households. Fast forward to the millennial reality in 2025, and that number has plummeted to just 47%, less than half. Marriage has historically been this massive driver of household establishment and wealth accumulation. So its delay, it represents a profound demographic and economic transformation.
Now, you might be wondering, why does this matter to everyone else? Well, that brings us to part 5, an uncertain economic future.
The truth is, the personal financial struggles of one generation are quickly escalating into severe national consequences. The projections from the Congressional Budget Office are pretty alarming. The federal budget is facing these persistent structural deficits, growing from 5.8% of GDP, which is about $1.9 trillion in fiscal year 2026, up to a staggering 6.7% of GDP, or $3.1 trillion, by 2036. The systemic inability of a massive generation to accumulate wealth and generate expected tax revenues contributes directly to this widening fiscal gap.
And those deficits, they trigger a whole wave of macroeconomic consequences. Because millennials are delaying childbirth, we now have a shrinking domestic-born labor force. Combine that with a rapidly aging population, and you get this unsustainable dependency ratio. That basically means fewer active workers are paying into the system to support a rapidly growing base of retirees. And with public debt projected to reach 120% of GDP by 2036, which would break the all-time record set right after World War II, the government's fiscal capacity to support safety nets like Social Security and Medicare is severely threatened. This isn't just a millennial problem anymore. It's a full-blown American economic crisis.
Which brings us nicely to the core thesis of all the data we've reviewed today. It's summarized perfectly in this quote from the Economic Analysis. The erosion of the American dream for millennials is not a product of unique generational consumer preferences, but rather the result of structural economic barriers. The official data effectively and completely dismantles the myth of a poor generational work ethic. The reality is that millennials are navigating a relentless obstacle course of unprecedented student loan balances, severe housing shortages, and massive real wage erosion.
So we have to end with this really pressing question. Can structural policy interventions save the American dream before it's too late? The data makes it incredibly clear that without significant, systematic adjustments, whether that means drastically expanding the housing supply, reforming student debt, or ensuring wage growth actually outpaces inflation, the traditional milestones of wealth building are going to remain completely out of reach. It really forces us to step back and ask what kind of economic future we actually want to build, and more importantly, who gets to participate in it. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Until next time, keep questioning those old narratives and keep looking at the numbers.